Imagine spending every single dollar you have on land that everyone, the bank, the farmers, the county experts said was completely dead. Not struggling, not damaged, dead. That's exactly what Curtis Wade did in 1971. And every single person in Cado County, Oklahoma, thought he had lost his mind. But 12 years later, a soil scientist from Oklahoma State University spread her lab results on the tailgate of her truck, looked at Curtis, and said something nobody had ever said about that ground before. This soil is better than anything in the state. This is the story of how a broke 6-year-old bought the worst land in Oklahoma for $50 an acre and turned it into the most productive ground in the county. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when you trust what you learned from someone who loved the land, even when the whole world is telling you to give up. Curtis Wade came home from Vietnam in 1970 with a Purple Heart, a bad knee, and about $6,000 in combat pay he'd never had the chance to spend. He spent the next year doing odd jobs, fencing and hay hauling, and saved another $6,000. Before the war, he'd worked on his grandfather Elton's farm outside Binger, Oklahoma. Elton Wade was the kind of farmer who didn't just work his land, he listened to it. He'd kneel down in his fields, grab a handful of soil, smell it, crumble it between his fingers, and teach young Curtis things no textbook had ever printed. He'd say, "You see how this breaks apart like cake? That's life in there. Worms, roots, fungus, all working together. When soil crumbles like that, it's healthy. When it clumps like concrete, it's struggling. And when it turns to powder and blows away, it's already dead." Elton passed away in 1969 while Curtis was overseas, and that wisdom went with him, or so everyone thought. By 1971, Curtis had $12,000 saved and a burning need to farm his own land. But decent farmland in Cado County was running $200 an acre, and his money wouldn't buy nearly enough to build a real operation. That's when he heard about the Dawson place. Howard Dawson had farmed 160 acres north of Anadarko from 1948 to 1965. He pushed that ground as hard as any man could. Wheat every single year, heavy chemical fertilizer every season, no rotation, no rest, no recovery time. By the early 1960s, his yields were already dropping. By 1965, his soil was so exhausted that wheat barely made 12 bushels an acre, less than half the county average. Howard quit, moved to Oklahoma City, and left the land sitting empty for 6 years. The topsoil started washing away in the spring rains. The organic matter, already gutted from years of abuse, dropped to nearly nothing. The county officially classified it as severely degraded, one step above worthless. The bank holding the note wanted it gone and listed it at $50 an acre, $8,000 total for 160 acres. Not a single farmer in the county wanted it. Curtis drove out on a Saturday morning in April of 1971 and saw exactly what everyone warned him about. The fields were hard-packed and cracked. Nothing was growing except weeds and thistle. When he knelt down and grabbed a handful of soil the way his grandfather had taught him, it didn't crumble like cake. It didn't even clump like concrete. It turned to powder and blew right out of his hand. By Elton's definition, this soil was already dead. But Curtis didn't stand up and drive away. He walked to the edges of the field, and that's where he saw something nobody else had bothered to look for. Along the fence lines, where Howard's plow had never reached, there was a narrow strip of ground, about 3 feet wide, that was completely different. Darker, softer, alive. Wild grasses had been growing undisturbed on those margins for decades, their roots quietly doing what roots do, breaking up compaction, feeding microbes, building structure beneath the surface. That fence-line soil was 6 inches of rich, dark, crumbly earth sitting right next to Howard's dead field like a before and after photograph placed side by side. Curtis knew exactly what that meant because his grandfather had taught him. The soil wasn't dead. It was sleeping. Howard had beaten it down, starved it, and stripped it bare. But the biology was still there, waiting at the edges. If someone gave it what it needed, roots and cover and rest and time, it would come back. Every other farmer had looked at the Dawson place and seen 160 acres of ruin. Curtis looked at those fence lines and saw proof of resurrection. Monday morning, he walked into the bank and paid $8,000 cash. He had $4,200 left to his name. 160 acres of sleeping soil, and an idea that nobody in the county believed in. Here's where the story gets difficult, because Curtis made a decision in 1971 that drove his neighbors absolutely insane. He didn't plant a single acre of cash crops that first year. Not one. In a county where every farmer planted every field every season because every dollar counted, Curtis Wade planted nothing anyone could sell. Instead, he seeded all 160 acres with a mix of crimson clover, hairy vetch, and cereal rye, the same cover crop species his grandfather had used along his own fence margins. Then he did something that made people genuinely question his sanity. He left it alone. Didn't plow it under. Didn't spray it. Just let it grow, die back, decompose, and feed the ground beneath it. Word spread fast. That Wade boy is growing weeds on purpose. He's planting clover on dead ground. Might as well plant prayers. The bank officer who sold him the land, a man named Phil Mercer, drove out in October, saw 160 acres of clover and rye waving in the wind, and shook his head all the way back to town. Curtis heard every word of it, the mocking, the pity, the whispered jokes at the diner. Some nights, he sat on the porch of the old broken-down farmhouse with no running water, eating rice and beans, working winters at the grain elevator just to keep the lights on, and he genuinely wondered if they were right. He'd spent everything on an idea that only he believed in. Year 2, he planted the same cover crop mix again. He also started walking his fields every single week with a shovel and a notebook, digging holes, studying what he found, counting worms, measuring root depth, noting the soil color and smell. By fall of 1972, the changes were small but real. The soil was darker in patches. The clover was fixing nitrogen back into the ground. When Curtis grabbed a handful from the thickest cover crop areas, it didn't blow away anymore. It barely held together, but it held. Year 3, more cover crops, more waiting, more neighbors shaking their heads. Curtis was nearly broke again. He took a full-time job at the grain elevator that winter just to survive. Then, in spring of 1974, 3 full years after he'd bought the Dawson place, Curtis finally planted his first cash crop. 40 acres of winter wheat on the ground that had received the heaviest cover cropping. The other 120 acres stayed in cover. When his neighbors' fields were knee-high, Curtis's wheat was still ankle-high, and the gossip hit a new peak. But Curtis watched that wheat through June and July, watched it thicken, watched the heads fill, watched the stems strengthen in soil that everyone had written off as finished. Harvest came in August. Those 40 acres made 24 bushels per acre. That number doesn't sound impressive until you remember that 3 years earlier, that same soil made 12 bushels under Howard Dawson. Curtis had doubled the yield without a single pound of chemical fertilizer, just cover crops, patience, and time. He netted $4,200, almost exactly what he'd paid for the land. Not enough to get rich, but enough to prove the soil was waking up. Curtis followed the same pattern every year after that. He moved more acres into cash crops each season and rotated the rest through cover. He never planted wheat on the same ground 2 years running. He added grain sorghum and soybeans to the rotation. He never touched synthetic fertilizer, relying only on what the cover crops returned to the soil naturally. And the yields climbed every single year like a staircase. By year 5, his wheat hit 28 bushels, right at the county average, but without the fertilizer costs his neighbors were carrying. Year 7, he hit 34 bushels, above average. Year 9, he hit 38 bushels per acre, the highest dryland wheat yield in Cado County that entire season. His neighbors were spending $200 an acre on fertilizer and still making 30 bushels. Curtis was spending almost nothing and beating them. People stopped laughing. They started showing up at his fence line with questions. What are you putting on that ground? Nothing? Nothing at all? No nitrogen, no phosphorus, just cover crops, rotation, and rest. That can't be right. You can't out-yield us with nothing. Curtis would look at them steadily and say, I'm not using nothing. I'm using everything that's already in the soil. I just stopped killing it. Phil Mercer, the banker who had warned Curtis he was buying a graveyard, stopped by in the spring of 1980. He stood at the fence and looked at fields that were dark and healthy and productive. And he said something that took some courage to say. Curtis, I owe you an apology for telling you that ground was dead, for thinking you were out of your mind. Curtis just nodded and asked him, "How did you know it wouldn't come back?" Phil didn't have an answer. Curtis did. "My grandfather taught me that soil isn't something you use up. It's something you take care of. It's alive. And anything alive can heal if you give it what it needs." In 1983, the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service ran a statewide soil health study, and Curtis's farm came up in the random sample. A young agronomist named Dr. Sarah Chen from Oklahoma State came out to take samples from 12 locations across his fields and compare them to 3 neighboring farms. When the lab results came back, she drove to the Dawson place personally because she needed to see it with her own eyes. She spread the reports on her truck's tailgate. Curtis's soil had 4.8% organic matter. The county average was 1.6%. His water infiltration rate was 3 times the county norm, meaning rain soaked in instead of running off. His microbial activity was unlike anything she'd recorded in the region. And his topsoil, which had measured just 2 inches when he bought the place in 1971, now measured nearly 6 inches. Dr. Chen looked at him and said, "In 12 years, you've built 4 inches of topsoil. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? The natural rate is roughly 1 inch per century. You've accomplished 400 years of soil building in 12. Curtis just looked at the numbers quietly and said, "I just did what my grandfather taught me." Dr. Chen published a research paper the following year. Other scientists came, then farmers from across the state, then journalists. The Dawson Place, the worst 160 acres in Cado County. The land every farmer in the county had passed on. The ground a banker had called a grave became an official demonstration site for soil regeneration. Curtis hosted visitors every spring for 15 years and never charged a single person a penny. Phil Mercer retired from banking in 1992. At his retirement dinner, someone asked him about the best loan he'd ever made. He didn't hesitate. "The worst loan I ever made turned out to be the best one," he said. "I sold a young veteran 160 acres of dead ground for $8,000 because I thought the land was worthless and the buyer was foolish. Turns out the land wasn't dead at all. We were just too ignorant to see what it needed." Curtis saw it when none of the rest of us could. By 2002, Curtis's land was appraised at $1,400 per acre. He'd paid $50 an acre in 1971, a 28 times return on land that everyone said was worthless. Curtis Wade is in his 80s now and still lives on the Dawson Place. He stopped farming it himself in 2014 and leased it to a young couple with exactly one condition: you don't kill the soil. You feed it. That's the only rule. He still walks those fields sometimes with a shovel. Still kneels down and grabs a handful and crumbles it between his fingers, the way his grandfather taught him 60 years ago. And it still crumbles like cake. The banker said the soil was dead. The county said it was finished. Every farmer in the area said it was a waste of money. Curtis Wade said none of those people had bothered to look at the fence lines. He spent 12 years and almost every dollar he had, proving that the things everyone calls dead are usually just the things that haven't been given what they need yet. He didn't bring that land back with money, or chemicals, or expensive machinery. He brought it back with clover, patience, and the lessons of a man who had been gone since 1969, but never really left. The banker called it dead. Curtis called it sleeping. And in the end, Curtis was right.